Hi everyone, thank you for joining us at the CGLCC's 2021 Global Business Summit. I'm Brett House, Deputy Chief Economist at Scotiabank, and I'm proud that we've returned as a sponsor of the summit and this next session. Scotiabank is committed to creating an environment where our customers and our employees can thrive. Through initiatives like Scotia Rise, we provide much-needed funding for essential community programs. At Scotiabank, we're proud to play a leadership role across our entire global footprint. Scotiabank recently announced new benefits for enhanced gender affirmation procedures for eligible employees and their dependents in Canada and the US. Additionally, in Trinidad and Tobago, we also announced this past year the extension of healthcare benefits to the same-sex partners of our employees, the first in the industry to include this benefit in the region. Scotiabank was also the first Canadian financial institution to sign on to the UN LGBTI Standards of Conduct in Business. And in celebration of the global solidarity those standards represent, I'd like to introduce our next session of the day on them with Kirsten Stewart from the World Economic Forum. Enjoy.
Hi, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us here today. Welcome to the roundtable on the UN Standards of Conduct. This time we're talking about businesses tackling discrimination against LGBTI people in partnership with PGLE, the Partnership for Global LGBTI and BSR, the Business for Social Responsibility. And I also want to take the opportunity to thank our session sponsor, Scotiabank, for bringing us all here together today. So my name is Kirsten Stewart. I'm the head of Shaping the Future of Media at the World Economic Forum. And this conversation is actually a continuation of a roundtable that I helped to co-moderate back on Monday for CGLCC. They brought together leaders of over 70 different global corporations to implement the UN Standards of Conduct for business tackling discrimination against LGBTI people. This event was sponsored by Scotiabank and IBM. I also want to take the opportunity to introduce Salah Husseini. Salah is leading BSR's consulting and collaboration efforts on human rights for companies in New York, including the Cross-Industry Human Rights Working Group. He supports companies through various human rights projects and has extreme expertise in consumer products, food and agriculture, manufacturing, media, and entertainment. Salah, over to you.
Hi, Kristen. Thank you very much for that warm introduction, and CGLCC for organizing this great event. What I wanted to talk about today was the UN standards and building on the discussion from the roundtable on Monday. And maybe if we could start by, there we go. In terms of the standards, what I thought I would do is kind of go through the history of those standards again, talk a little bit about what they entail, and then focus in on standard 4, which is all about supplier engagement and what companies can do in terms of promoting the standards with their business partners or through their business partners, including suppliers and vendors. So if we go on to the next slide. Talking a little bit about the origin of the standards. So these standards were conceived of in the World Economic Forum's Davos platform many years ago, and really build on the broader human rights world of rights and privileges that are entitled to all of us. I have up on the screen a quote from Zeid Ra'ad Al Hussein, who was the former UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, talking about the origin for developing the standards as a turning point in the long overdue conversation about the role that companies can play in promoting LGBTI rights, both within their companies and beyond. And not just from a promotion perspective, but also more importantly, tackling discrimination against LGBTI rights, again, within companies' own workplaces, but more importantly, through those business partnerships and in the communities in which they do business. So in essence, that was the impetus for the development of these standards and creating an international benchmark and set of principles that corporations and other business actors around the world can align their corporate practices against. This is also unprecedented because, and as we know, the legal landscape for LGBTI inclusivity around the world runs the gamut from inclusive in places like Canada and to a certain extent the US and Western Europe, to extremely discriminatory in other parts of the world. And so having an international benchmark, an international standard, especially one approved by and developed by the UN, creates that opportunity for global or international alignment and is the first of its kind. So really, it sets a number of important precedents in that respect. If we could go on to the next slide. Okay, so just a brief kind of history of the standards and how they fit into that broader human rights framework. So all of this, including these UN standards, build off of the first set of human rights principles, which is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights established in 1948. For those of you familiar with the human rights field, this, as you know, is sort of the essence of the human rights world and really created the space universally. And the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was developed in response to the tragedies of World War II, and really was the first international instrument to codify the principles of business and human rights in reaction to World War II, and establish what all of us as human beings are entitled to as rights and privileges. Historically, that expectation was of enforcement was very much related to governments. It was the purview and expectation and responsibility of governments to protect those rights on behalf of its citizens. But obviously, we've come a long way since then, and there's a lot of additional actors who can take responsibility for that protection. Since 1948, the field has moved in the direction of expecting the private sector to play a significant role in that protection, beginning first with the UN Global Compact's 10 principles in the year 2000, then moving on to the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which were published in 2011, which don't create any new human rights, but apply those expectations and responsibility for protection to the private sector. That is in essence sort of how we get to the UN standards of conduct for business tackling discrimination against LGBTI people. Similarly, they don't create any new human rights, but instead provide a framework and context for which the private sector can play a role in supporting LGBTI people, both within their businesses and through business partnerships and in the communities in which they do business, by protecting against discrimination, promoting positive rights, and generally engaging in the promotion of the concept of inclusivity. If you go to the next slide. So these standards were published and issued in September of 2017. There was a launch event in New York in 2017 by the former High Commissioner. And since that time, we've had many companies begin to, in essence, operationalize these standards, which basically means take the principles and start to integrate them into their own operations, as well as how they do business through business relationships in the communities in which they operate, and in the long term, in the ultimate goal, through the promotion of these principles by advocating with governments and in communities and in the societies in which they do business. Next slide. So just to briefly summarize an overview of what these standards are, again, they already build on, or they're building on, existing international human rights norms. They're not necessarily creating anything new, but instead are providing a practical guidance to companies on how to meet their responsibilities to respect and protect the rights of LGBTI people. Again, we're talking both in terms of your own workplaces as companies, but also looking beyond that through your business relationships and supply chains, with customers and other forms of business engagements. And they also call upon businesses to leverage their power and their influence to push relationships beyond just those business engagements, talking about engagements with communities and societies and governments around the world. And these are established in 5 sets of principles or standards. And if we go to the next slide, we can talk about those. And they're laid out in 4 sets, and there are 5 principles. So the first one is, at all times, there's an expectation for companies to respect human rights. So broadly speaking, all of those human rights codified in the Universal Declaration, but specifically as it applies to LGBTI people. The second location is in the workplace, and there are two expectations here. The first is to eliminate discrimination against LGBTI people, and the second is to provide support. Provide support can mean many different things, but it includes, for example, as Scotiabank mentioned in the interview, providing extended benefits to your employees, ensuring that the benefits that they receive in more challenging locations are at least equivalent to other employees, and providing training and cultural sensitivity awareness in order to make those employees feel part of the broader employee community. Then standard 4 is about that broader marketplace. So the expectation here is that companies prevent other human rights violations beyond the four walls of their company. So engaging with suppliers, engaging with customers. This includes initiatives like supplier diversity programs and the like. So really pushing beyond your four walls into how you're doing business with others. Then the 5th standard is about acting in the community and acting in the public sphere. And this is all about how companies are asked to or expected to use their influence and advocacy to support LGBTI NGOs or civil society organizations where they're doing business, try to use their leverage to influence negative community perceptions around LGBTI people through advertising or marketing campaigns, and probably most influentially, how companies are being asked to engage with governments in those locations where they're doing business. And in this case, we're especially talking about really pushing back against regressive laws and restrictions on LGBTI communities in those more challenging environments, whether that is through individual consultations with governments, collectively with other companies and peers, or in partnership with NGOs and other types of actors to really push those regressive laws in and push governments and other actors in the right direction. So in a nutshell, those are the 5 standards. And as you see, they sort of expect certain things within different spheres of influence, but using the leverage of business and the power of business to really drive change where they are located and have a presence. I just wanted to cover one more slide, if we can go to the next one, and really drill down on standard 4, which is about preventing other human rights violations through the relationships and engagements that businesses have. And this one is really relevant to the work of CGLCC. In essence, what this means is companies using their business relationships should be really pushing those expectations that they are developing in-house in terms of preventing discrimination and supporting LGBTI communities. That means working with diverse suppliers and identifying LGBTI suppliers to work with. And that can be done in partnership with organizations like CGLCC. It also means vetting your suppliers and other business partners to make sure that they are not discriminating against LGBTI employees or communities, and really developing a process or a procedure to identify those violations and nudge those business relationships in the right direction. So this is a really important standard, and I think really relevant to the work that CGLCC is doing in the topic today. So happy to explore this in more detail during the Q&A. So thank you.
Thank you, Salah. Let's also have a bit of a discussion around this, but I thought I might kick it off with a bit of a recap about the conversation that we had that you referred to off at the top, the roundtable, the UN roundtable that we held that kicked off all these sessions earlier this week. We were very lucky to have with us the Minister of Innovation, Science and Industry, François-Philippe Champagne, and he, for the first time since the unveiling of the UN Standards of Conduct for Business in 2017, this was the first time that the Canadian government showed its support officially and announced that at the UN roundtable just earlier this week, and it was an amazing and significant moment, I think. He encouraged all the attendees, consisting of, we had more than 200 leaders representing over 70 of the largest global companies operating in Canada and around the world, including founding members of PGLE, roundtable sponsors Scotiabank and IBM. And he encouraged everyone to adopt the standards of conduct of business and learn how their businesses can lead in LGBTI inclusivity. So I thought maybe, Sala, it would be good for us to maybe have a bit of a discussion, and also we'll invite questions from the attendees here today virtually. Please, put your questions into the chat box, and I will try to get to them as much as we can. But I thought, Sala, to start off, you mentioned the Standard 4 and how well it aligns with the work that the CGLCC is doing around inclusive business practices, supplier diversity that you mentioned. Can you talk about how businesses can approach operationalizing Standard 4? Like, what are the things that they can do to actually put them into practice?
Certainly. So in addition to developing supplier diversity programs, which a lot of leading companies already have in place, but really looking to integrate those principles of supplier diversity by working with expert organizations like CGLCC to find ways to identify and select LGBTI inclusive and led or developed businesses. So that's one way, and that's maybe one of the easier ways to do that. Some of the other ways that we've seen as best practices really come from the more established responsible sourcing field. That field is really built upon identifying and vetting suppliers from a general human rights or labor standards approach. So doing things like integrating or developing codes of conduct that speak to LGBTI inclusivity or promotion of LGBTI rights. It includes maybe contractual language that maybe refers to the UN standards, as an example, can include supplier trainings. So having sessions with your suppliers about the UN standards of conduct to walk through what the expectations are and train them on how to integrate those standards as their own, and really favoring those types of suppliers that embrace these expectations and try to integrate them themselves. So a lot of this work can replicate the maybe the more established field of responsible sourcing by having an additional lens or layer or focus on LGBTI inclusivity as part of that assessment and diligence process.
Fantastic. And a couple of questions that we're getting in from the folks participating here today. I think, taking a global view of, these standards, can you maybe give us some examples of what you consider to be best in class in terms of some of the corporations and companies that you find, either membership through the PGLE or otherwise, that you think are leading by example that really stand out for you?
If we're talking in relation to Standard 5, it is admittedly early days, but some of the best examples that we're seeing really tend to focus on that supplier diversity component, where companies have taken that internationally and working in particular in countries where the landscape is more challenging in terms of being out or being a recognized LGBTI owned business. And really working with local communities or local NGOs to identify those businesses, prioritize them as part of those supplier diversity programs, and provide those small businesses with the support that they need to really thrive in those more challenging environments. So I would say those are some of the best practices and leading examples that we've seen in the field in the international context. But again, it is quite early days in terms of both standards 4 and 5 in terms of engagement and advocacy.
And actually, you bring up a good point, which is also something that the audience is asking about in terms of the global nature of these standards. And we have a question here, particularly for someone representing in India, and just they're wondering about, are the standards applicable to all jurisdictions? Are they applied equally? Are governments allowed to amend as they see fit? How are the standards applied when you look at it on a global basis?
Yeah, that's a very good question. These standards are really meant and tailored towards the business community. So they are international in nature. They are meant to set expectations in terms of what businesses can do in support of LGBTI communities, even in locations where it may be legally prohibited to be, to engage in same-sex relationships or same-gender relationships or or other penalties for LGBTI people. These are not meant to be standards, in essence, that are ratified by governments. These are principles, in essence, and principles tailored to the business community. So, even if you're operating in an environment where there may be tension between the expectations articulated in these standards or principles and local law or local jurisdiction, there are ways around those tensions, because these are best practices aimed at the business community, as opposed to expected to be ratified by local governments. If that distinction makes sense.
No, absolutely. And I guess the suggestion is that, given that these are economic drivers and that there are, valid proof points when it comes to the benefits to business and the economies overall, when you include, when you include and respect diversity, I guess, there is something to be said for the actual validity behind, these standards. There are business practices, and there are benefits to countries who understand and accommodate these, because their businesses and their economies thrive because of them. Are you finding that to be helpful in terms of, because I think we do see many, many proof points when it comes to how well economies thrive when they use when they pull on the benefits of diversity in their workforce and in their economies.
Yeah, absolutely. And we know that to be a motivator for companies developing diversity, equity, and inclusion programs in more favorable locations. That's something that we hear consistently, is these programs help us attract better talent. We're able to retain more. But more importantly, there's many studies, and CGLCC is probably able to provide much better examples of this than I am. But there's a lot that shows that similarly on an international level, when cities or countries are more diverse in nature and able to retain and attract talent to those locations, those businesses in those those cities and those countries tend to be economically more sound. They're much more prosperous than others that are not tolerant or have discriminatory laws on the books. So that type of that type of indicator is really, it works at the corporate level, and it works at the country or city level as well.
Yeah, and if I could just share some of my own personal experience, I have been, in the media business for quite some time, and I think the one thing that we learned very early, and I think is proven again in the successful ways that we can engage audiences, is that you can't be what you can't see. And I think the representation and diversity in terms of how the media business reflects inclusivity throughout, whether it's in front of cameras, behind cameras, storytellers, it's so incredibly important. It is definitely a moral and social responsibility, but it's also a business imperative, because ultimately, if you don't represent your audience in a significant way, again, whether it's on camera or behind the scenes, whether it's your journalists, your editors, you cannot tell the full story. And I think the best way to engage audiences is through an authenticity, and that authenticity in storytelling comes from people with different perspectives and who actually live in different communities. And I think particularly, when you think of this community, the underrepresentation in the stories that this community can tell has been quite absent, and we're finally seeing, I think, some of the stories. I think we've seen some great work done by GLAAD, for example, who have, as an association, really held the media industry to account in terms of how much representation and inclusivity they have with the LGBTI group, and actually, have their own version of standards that I think the community pays attention to and wants to score well on. So I think, it's definitely a society imperative, but it's also a business imperative to make sure that we can maintain and grow audiences by them being able to identify with us. And so I think that's an important point that can be translated into any industry, I think.
Yeah, that's absolutely true.
And do you find that any industries in particular, like when you take a look globally, are there things that stand out for you in terms of best practices, or are there any areas that you wish would pay more attention to the standards?
It's a good question. So, certainly applying, at least when thinking about providing support internally in those more challenging environments, we've seen some companies, identify really creative ways to do that, to get around that tension with local law and local jurisdiction, whether that is establishing really strong connections with global ERGs for those local employees, or kind of getting around restrictions of same-sex marriage by hiring an employee's partner in order to transfer them to that local country where otherwise it would be impossible to get them there under immigration status or restrictions.
Right.
So those are some really good examples of kind of creative solutions to get over that tension between what the standards call for and those local prohibitions. But there's a number of other ones that I think demonstrate exactly what you're talking about, that the need for representation really requires pushing the boundaries of what these more challenging markets allow for or restrict against. And so companies are really making an effort in that regard.
Yes, and just one more question from the audience before we close this up. Given that I think we have a deeper understanding and more awareness of different cultural genders and sexualities, two-spirit, asexual. Are there intentions to share these standards and include others as well in the standards? Can you? I guess the question is really around how evolving are the standards, and how do you make sure that everybody, all different versions of diversity within the LGBTQI community, are represented?
That's a really good question. So I think there is enough flexibility in the standards that the sort of the scope of coverage and the types of communities that are considered as part of the assessment process can be expanded. One way we are doing this is by building a gap analysis tool to help companies understand how well they have operationalized the standards and provide a roadmap to integrating the standards further. And that is something that can be updated over time as our understanding of who might benefit from these standards and our understanding of communities and identity grows. So there's quite a bit of flexibility that's built into the way that they're structured and the way that they're written.
Fantastic. That's so important. Well, thank you again, Salah. It was really important to have this conversation and great to hear from you around the standards. I want to remind everybody that if you want to learn more about the standards, please reach out to either Dale or Daryl and see how you can get involved. I think that's the purpose of these conversations here, is to remind everybody that we all have a role to play. And if you want deeper information on how to do so as an individual, as a company, please reach out to Dale and Daryl, and we can get you even more deeply involved. I want to close the session by actually playing a video that we were able to show at the roundtable, and it's specific to Standard 4. It refers to the marketplace and how we can prevent other human rights violations. And I want to also remind everybody after the video that our next session at 1 p.m. will be Unstoppable Talk with Daniel Pilali. So I want to thank you again for joining us. Thank you again, Salah, for all the work that you're doing. And thank you, everybody, for joining and taking the time with us today. Let's take a look at the video, and then we'll go on to Daniel. Thank you very much.
Standard number 4. In the marketplace, prevent other human rights violations. Businesses should not discriminate against LGBTI suppliers, distributors, or customers, and should use their leverage to prevent discrimination and related abuses by their business partners. Hi, my name's Connie Stacy. I'm the president of Growing Greener Innovations, a battery energy storage systems manufacturer located in Edmonton, Alberta. Supplier diversity programs are really crucial. Often it's the unconscious bias that makes it so difficult to get in the door. And programs like this really, they help you get past that initial bias. When I first started out in this business, I'll be frank, everybody thought I was crazy. A woman who was gonna make batteries didn't happen. A gay woman who was gonna make batteries, I was pretty much laughed out of the room. And the most access I got was through programs with the CGLCC, where suddenly I found myself speaking directly with the energy buyer for Procter & Gamble, or the procurement specialist with Bell Canada. I mean, the list went on. And to get those introductions without the CGLCC, without supplier diversity programs, would have been near impossible. I'm an entrepreneur who has had the opportunity to travel quite a bit because my product is primarily for export, more so than domestic. So when I've gone to places like India, like Indonesia, the way I'm treated is not the way I'm treated in Canada. And it won't change in other places unless people are willing to take the lead. And so much of that lead really has to come from business. It can't be, I don't believe, from governments. It has to be the everyday people in organizations that operate all around the world that show everybody that this is okay, that different is good, that different isn't bad. When I've traveled, I've had experiences where I've not felt safe using public bathrooms. I've felt physical violence was something I had to be prepared for. I don't face that every day in Canada, thankfully, not anymore, but it's still so prevalent throughout the world. And to me, it's so much more than just what we do in Canada. Everybody has a responsibility to set a standard for the world. If you believe that people are equal, regardless of race, of sexual orientation, all of the things that we so often place bias on, if you believe that is true, then I think you have an obligation to participate in making it a better world for everyone.
Hello, my name is Felipe Cárdenas and I am the president of the Colombian LGBT Chamber of Commerce. Colombia has the second most advanced legislation for LGBT rights within the Latin American region. The only country that maybe surpasses us is Uruguay. The main challenge of this is how we are able to translate all those rights that are pretty recent for the last 4 or 5 years, not only from the paper, but actually to the reality, and especially to the business reality of our country. The corporations, especially if they are multinationals and they have operations here in Colombia, understand the entire diversity framework easier, but our main challenge is how we can bring all these inclusive and equity and diversity knowledge to the Colombian businesses, the middle ones and the big Colombian corporations, and how they can incorporate all that legislation and all that framework and piece of legislation towards their own processes and protocols to make sure those working spaces are discrimination-free. Regarding supplier diversity for the Colombian territory, this is a very new concept. The Colombian LGBT Chamber of Commerce, partnering with other chambers that are more advanced on inclusive procurement, such as the American one, the US one, and the Canadian one, we have been able to connect properly all those corporations and their procurement departments with the small businesses we have as members of the chambers that actually already got registered and certified as diverse suppliers. We, little by little, have been able to introduce to all those procurement departments how they can put into practice the theory of inclusive procurement, opening spaces, hosting events, connecting with all those diverse suppliers we have in place. And finally, I would say very recently, even with the pandemic in the last year, virtually, we have been able to make all those connections between those procurement departments and the small businesses. And finally, that inclusive procurement policy is passing from the theory to the practice and to the reality, and those businesses are getting the contracts they were pursuing.